Hello everybody and welcome back. This time chapter 14. We're going to treat 14 a little like we did 13. I'm going to kind of go through it quickly. If you're in the healthcare field, be sure that you take time to study it. There's gold here. If you're in IT, security, or setting policy in the healthcare field, by all means study this. The rest of us should read it, review it, and have an understanding. So frankly, the genesis of the healthcare security started in 1996 with the Hipaa law. Then that developed into the Hipaa privacy rules, which were published in 2002, the Hipaa security rules in 2003, and the Hipaa security enforcement rules in 2006. So in this chapter, we're going to examine the three components of the Hipaa security rule, the High-Tech Act, which and the omnibus rule. That's really the focus, right? Section 18 of ISO 27002 is dedicated to the compliance management domain. It would include a lot of these things into it. Similarly with NIST, it has several publications. SP 800, right, the Special Pubs -122, that will address PII. 800-66 is HIPAA. 800-111 is storage encryption. -52 are guidelines for TLS or transport layer security. -77 is IPsec VPNs, and -113, 800-113 is SSL VPN. So you'll want to make sure you review all of those yourself. These are the objectives for our conversation. And so in this process, right, we are going to go through these various acts, as I've already mentioned. So HIPAA security rule, it focuses on establishing electronic PHI, right? Electronic PHI, which is really going to be, that's that protected health information that we all are concerned with. So the Hipaa security rule establishes finally national standards for patient records and how we protect them. And so the security rule, this requires appropriate administrative, physical, and technical safeguards that are going to ensure CIA that we have been so focused on as we create policy in this course. Okay. So the main goal of HIPAA security rule, as I mentioned, is CIA of all of these records. And so it is going to apply them through these various standards. Now, the standards are intentionally non-specific and scalable because in HIPAA there are varying sizes of organizations from very, very small to very, very, very large. And so the rules were intentionally a little vague, right? What is not vague anymore are the covered, are the fines that go with it in the process. So DHS has an office called OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, and they are responsible for investigating violations or enforcing the security rule that we're talking about. As I mentioned, fines have grown significantly. Now, if you're found in non-compliance, you know, it can be up to $1.5 million per violation. And so power has been given to the CE in this process, right? The person which is the covered entity that we're talking about, CE. And so it can get very expensive. And so the security rule is our first approach, and this is organized into 5 categories. There's administrative safeguards, which are going to document policies and procedures in the conduct, etc., of an access of our workforce, etc. Then there are physical safeguards like to facilities, equipment, and media. There are technical safeguards to protect electronic PHI data, which would include data in motion and data in use and data at rest. I would even include now data in the cloud, right? And then there are organizational requirements, which are about the contracts, third parties, vendors. These people have access to our data. What are they doing with it? Are they selling it? Are they securing it appropriately, etc.? And then we want to document the requirements, right, to address the retention of records, the availability of records, and when we update records along the way. Now, the security, information security has many standards along the way, and specifications can be required and addressable in the approach that we choose, right? Now, the book goes into then some more detail about administrative safeguards. You can read some more on that on your own on page 446 at the bottom. Okay. Administrative safeguards then continue in terms of securing the responsibility and the workforce management, and all of that continues through page 449. So, for example, when we assign security responsibility, which is the second standard in the administrative safeguards section, the security rule specifically states that the CE must designate an individual as the security officer. So you would look for the security officer, know that they have this role of security responsibility under administrative safeguards, right? To ensure measures to protect data and oversight of access to the data. And then, of course, there's a workforce security, right, which is the third standard. And this standard focuses on the relationship between people and these records, these ePHI, as we're terming it now, to ensure that the appropriate policies, procedures, and safeguards are in place. I would even say if your role in an organization is to create Hipaa policy, I would walk the process, right? Don't just create policy, but before you create policy, walk the process, see how it works. Notice they use the term workforce purposely, not personnel. Personnel are generally those in the organization's payroll, but the workforce is anyone who does the work for the organization. That can include vendors, business partners, contractors, etc. Okay. And then back to chapter 3, we defined authorization, right? Who's authorized this stuff? And so this was the process of granting users and systems a predetermined level of access, right? So now we want to apply that to ePHI and say who should have access to this, right? And so CEs, these entities need to address whether all members of the workforce should see it or not. You even want to work with HR to have an offboarding process, right? How do you recover access control devices, ID badges, keys, tokens, laptops, PDAs, pagers, and deactivate them in the remote workforce? Now, information access is the fourth standard in the administrative safeguards, and the goal here is to require that CEs have formal policies for granting access to PHI. And you might be thinking, well, we've already done this, right? So, but from the previous standard, CEs had to determine roles, jobs, or positions that should have permissions and have a termination process. This standard is addressing the process of authorizing and establishing that access, right? So that's kind of the difference between the two. You also want to conduct security awareness and training, covered in some detail on page 450. And because users themselves are the first line of defense against attack, intrusion, and error, right? Don't click on that link, we keep saying, right? And this slide is meant as an example. What can happen when we click on the link? Well, we can give away our credentials, right? So when the user's username and password are used, right? An attacker here, notice, they may steal the credentials. Even if your credentials are stolen and a week later, 2 weeks later, you say, well, nothing's happened to me. Don't take that lightly. This is one reason we don't want common passwords, right? Because the attacker can take those credentials and actually use them to stuff. It's called credential stuffing, right? And so the attacker stuffs these credentials, the usernames and passwords, until they gain access into another system that they know you would have access to, like Facebook, for example. So you want to use different passwords. And at the bottom of the slide, I show 3 solutions that you can use to stop credential stuffing. Pause the video, read it for yourself. It's kind of self-explanatory. But we can use a web application firewall, which notice between, we could also use token authentication. So instead of using a user, so down at the bottom I have where the web application firewall would go before the application itself. Okay. The next would be tokenization, right? Where these people can go through, get authenticated by tokens, going through an authentication gateway before getting access to another site. We do this all the time with OAuth or Federation using SAML procedures. And then, of course, is education. Now, security incident procedures are covered on page 451. You'll want to review that. Really, we want to ensure that we safeguard against loss of CIA again in both reporting and responding to security incidents. We want to have contingency plans like we talked about in chapter 12. So that contingency plans standard would is really tied to the business continuity plan that we already talked about. So you could read the notes in this chapter and go back to chapter 12 to review those. And then, of course, you want to evaluate the plans and processes along the way, right? All the other covered entities. Now, you want to make sure that the facilities are safeguarded. Remember, if somebody gets access to your server, so they have access to your network. You want to avoid that by locking the server room, having no windows, those sort of things. So physical security becomes very important, right? And I just want to remind you, there are levels of security. We can have physical security, communication security, computer security, and network security. So physical security is one very important aspect. Here's one place it can be applied. Notice physical security is the first layer of the OSI network, just as an example, right? And so we want to secure the physical layer. We want to make sure that there are not keyloggers, for example, on our systems in the physical layer. And so we want to apply physical security as an important step in ensuring information security, right? Even with the facility, we'll want to deter, delay, detect, to be able to assess and respond. So these would be very important notes as we walk through physical security aspects, right? And so those physical security controls would apply to workstations, for example. Endpoint detection and response becomes very important. At the endpoint is where the work is really being done. So if you can protect that, you want to put security as close to the user as possible, the server, the workstation, etc. Okay, and so even USB devices, you want to make sure that they're encrypted, that people can't download or upload USB devices like external hard drives or USBs themselves. You can find more on that on page 457 at the bottom. So there are other technical safeguards like access control. We've talked about lots of times, auditing and personal integrity. So trying to protect identity, then authentication, authorization, and finally ensuring accountability in the process, right? So again, we're back to these business association contacts and the policies and procedures that we can use to apply the various controls as it pertains to Hipaa. Okay, that's really all I've got for this chapter. Let's call it, take a break, come back.